Are you ready?
I am ready.
Chafen, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Let's get going. Go.
Welcome everyone to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark. Today's guest is Chafen Hart, and she will be talking to us about parenting a neuroatypical child when you are neurotypical. Chafen, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself and we can get started.
Hi, I'm Chafen Hart. I'm a general pediatrician. And when I'd been in practice a few years, I had my oldest child, who is now almost 11, diagnosis of autism at about 2. And it threw me into a whole world of developmental delays.
You broke up there for just a second, Chafen.
I really enjoyed learning about it. It's something I'd love to talk about. I have 2 other neurotypical kids, sort of actually. One of them is ADHD, so I know a little about that too, but mild. And it's one of my favorite topics. And of course, as a parent of an atypical child, you start thinking, am I truly neurotypical? This is a chronic question. Find yourself doing something and you're like, wait a second. But I've learned so much about the atypical world.
Thank you for saying that, because every time, welcome to the Collegial Conversations, and we're really excited to have this conversation. I love talking about parenting in general, but this is an issue close to my heart as well. I don't like using the words neurotypical and neuroatypical any more than I like using disorder when we're talking about this issue. I look at us all on this big continuum, right? And the more I hear about neuroatypicality, I'm like, yeah, I have that feature. Yeah, I have that feature too. So it's sort of like the med student who every time they read a new disease says they have that. I feel that way about myself and when we discuss neurotypicality. So can we start off with just when the world uses what neurotypical is, what does that mean?
I know. I think that they have been more successful defining neuroatypical, trying to sort of compartmentalize the, DSM-5 criteria, go into these certain, you have to have in these settings, these number of idiosyncratic sort of tendencies. But of course, you could have many of these parts of the diagnosis and not be defined as neuroatypical. They would call you typical. So I think it's so dependent on time and place and age. One of the things as a parent that I have found really important to embrace, and not just as a parent of a child with an autism diagnosis, but also as a just general parent, is that you have to use these features in yourself to improvise with parenting. Like you think that you're going to read a book or a paper or listen to an expert and you're going to apply an algorithm to your child and everything will work out. or you'll take a specific problem and you'll just be like, there are puzzle pieces and we'll figure out the puzzle piece. And that's not how it works. So much of it is trial and error. And you have to think creatively and you have to use your own experience and be like, gosh, okay, when I was this age, I was freaking out in a restaurant, could it have been this or that? And then it's a lot of just working with feeding off of the sort of the signals you get from your child to figure out how to parent. And for someone like me who's like, I'm going to read all about it and then I'll know, this is difficult. But yeah, there's been a few times where my husband and I look at each other and we go, okay, the atypical part of our brain would react to this like this, so this must be what he's thinking.
And does it work? Does it work? Does it help you connect? Because in my opinion, all of parenting, Chafen, is how do we connect with our kids, right?
And it's so important to return to the individual. I find a lot of parents get mired in trying to get advice, trying to read advice, trying to organize their thoughts, when really just sitting and being present with the child as an individual will help them figure out their child better than all the books. So it's difficult. We have a funny story where for like a few years, we couldn't figure out why my son would not eat in certain restaurants and would kind of get very anxious and react to everything. And we were sitting there, we thought it was certain smells and colors. And a couple years later, as he became more verbal, he clarified that no, 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 it's because they have pictures on the walls and he hated the pictures. And we were like, that's why every time his sister had a juice box with a character, he would turn it around so he didn't have to see it. And that's why the restaurants with abstract art were his most successful eating experiences. These little things that we just racked our brains and couldn't come up with what was the sensory trigger here. But you have to be creative. You can't look in a book to figure this out. You have to do some trial and error. It's true.
So I remember as a mother, one of my big things was the football hold, right? The child kicking their feet behind you and their head wailing, because there were many, many moments in my son's early years where I had to use that for almost any activity.
Yeah. Well, and then of course you think you've solved it and the next child's totally different, doesn't
Or the
But
next phase is totally different.
yes, yeah. You're like, I figured out sleep. I think it really applies to a lot of regular things like sleep patterns in infants. There are a few kids that fit a mold, but a lot of them you're just grasping at straws, taking ideas from everywhere. Another in that realm too, when I talk to parents right after a new diagnosis, I try to remember that for them, it's like having a broken heart and being blinded at the same time. It's like walking up a mountain and all of a sudden you can't see and your heart is broken. And for a lot of these parents, they want to get a guide. They want someone to hold their hand and take them up this mountain and tell them at every step, where there's a crag and whatever. But all you've got is kind of partial maps and some experts and some people who've done a similar hike. That's kind of all you have. And so it feels overwhelming and you want to just bring in all this information, but sometimes you just have to stop and breathe and be patient and present with the child to sort of see where you're going to need to step next. And it's hard to remember that, but just trying to help people just try something new for what you're doing isn't working, and can read all the books, but they won't help you every time.
I do remember having the conversation. It won't work every time because it is so idiosyncratic. Part of the atypicality is that the typical things don't necessarily work.
I
So
don't.
no, but I do remember I was in my 40s when my son was born. His dad was in his 50s. And I remember looking at him and him looking at me, and we laughed and just said, you know what? We've got almost 100 years of life experience between us, and this kid is kicking our ass.
So true. It's so true. I mean, it's humbling, and that's one of the gifts, I think, that there's a whole group of peripheral gifts that you get from going through the process of parenting in general. Definitely, if you've got a delayed kid or someone who challenges you in a way that you've never seen. But one of them is that you are humbled and it helps you be open-minded about others. And you kind of have to define what's important to your family. Once you get through sort of a grief phase with a new diagnosis, you have to define that and have to be on the same page. So it can be, of course, really devastating for some families to get through, and a lot of relationships don't survive. But if they can, there's a lot of peripheral gifts you get from it. But I think that learning to be non-judgmental, open to people, and creative with improvisational parenting are some of the best things.
I like that. I like that. Can you introduce us with some words to your son? Tell us about
Oh,
him.
sure. Hal, well, he was a really classic Cantor type autism in that old term that people use, Cantor type, but I think that really it just means he was the very nonverbal, seemed to have a lot of sensory issues kind of kid. And he really did not speak until 4, but he started in a lot of therapy very early on at 18 months. and he was kind of classic. It's so unpredictable. He had a group of kids that he did so much therapy with in those early years, and they're all in really different places now as older kids. They all have completely different talents and gifts that you wouldn't have been able to predict, I think. He's now almost 11 and he's done very well. We were incredibly fortunate because we had resources, and we not only had resources ourselves, but in our area, we had some expert therapists who were really good. And then, of course, there is a natural progression for every kid that's different. And his was to get over a lot of the sensory things early. He didn't have any self-harming behaviors, which is a huge gift. And he is a very gentle personality. And so now he's mainstreamed in a private school. He does, and this is another part of that unpredictability. But when you get a diagnosis like this, you often look and think, okay, so it says they won't have abstraction ability or it will be limited. Okay, so that means no sense of humor, and that means no relationship with a religion or with a god. Oh, and that means all these things. And the hardest part for a parent is just being like, actually, we just really don't know. Like we don't know. And his personality is intricately tied with his autism, but he is verbal and adapted enough that I can see that personality. And so, I mean, that's sort of
Have
my
a sense
wish
of
for every
humor? Do
parent.
you guys connect in laughter?
Yeah. He is very strange, but he is very funny.
Yeah.
And I was picking up at school last week, and the librarian had done a video for a teacher that was retiring. And he apparently made up a whole song on the spot for her. She was the music teacher, and sang this song that was sort of like a limerick in verse. And she came over to the car and she goes, "Your son is really funny. I don't know where he came up with this." And we were like, he's a diagnosis of autism. She's like, okay, yeah. I guess
Really?
because you think in a different pattern. And that's that neurodiversity piece of it is so valuable to the society. I watch him and a lot of these peers, and I'm like, no one would think this way in a crowd, or maybe they wouldn't want to admit it, but this is valuable. Like, you need someone who can bring these things to the table. But he's a lot of fun, and he's actually at this point in life, although when he was younger, he did have a lot of the characteristic meltdowns, a lot of issues with food, a lot of issues with noise, and all of these things. And it was very hard as a parent to not have a child speak to you for years and not know who they are. But at this point, he is by far my easiest child to parent. and
Really?
and he is so much fun. We really enjoy him because we don't know what he's going to do next. It helps that he is a very gentle soul, and that makes a huge difference. And we also just look at each other like, where did he come from? Like, who is this kid? And that'd be my wish, is that we get to a place where we're able to treat autism well and help them adapt to society and communicate, but also where society will be accepting enough that a parent will never wonder what their child would be like without this kind of diagnosis, that they will only just, relish kind of
Right.
what the diagnosis can bring to them. That would be a dream, is that you could get to that point where everyone's functional enough and everyone's accepting enough that they could see those benefits of who their child is, since it's so intricately intertwined with personality and everything about the child. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's been fun. As a pediatrician, I start forgetting already those difficult parts at the beginning. And I imagine if anyone watches this conversation, it will often be a parent who is just receiving a diagnosis, or maybe they have an older child, but they're just realizing that they are Asperger-like, or have some of these tendencies. And I forget what that was like at the time, because you just have no idea where things are going. But you just want people to be patient and stick with it, and they'll get to know their child.
Yeah. And love that child for whatever
Love
that
child.
typicality or neuroatypicality that they.
Yeah. It is hard to make an attachment. And as a baby, he appeared to be, I remember actually saying this out loud multiple times, that he seemed like an alien, and I'm trying to accustom him to life on Earth. And later getting his diagnosis, a lot of that made sense. He did not communicate in the same way as his sisters. And I thought, gosh, this poor alien doesn't want to be on this earth, and I'm forcing him to try to attach to me. But yes, it takes time and patience, and it may not be as natural a relationship. You have to work on it. As with anything.
Right. How about your other kids? How did they respond? How do they respond?
Well, and that's another one of those peripheral gifts that people overlook and forget has happened to their family. But my middle one was very verbal. She is ADHD, and of course, those spectrums overlap quite a bit. There were times when she was young where we were like, is she on the spectrum? Like, there's definitely some social misdirection, social difficulty there. But no, she's really a more ADHD, very mild though. But she was a baby who had to sleep in the therapist's office her whole first 2 years. She was asleep in the corner. I had this whole bed made up in one of his ADAs. She is very close with her brother because developmentally, socially, they're kind of on the same page, even despite the 2-year difference. And she struggles to keep up with him academically. And the great part is she's that kind of popular, bubbly kid, but she has learned about being accepting because I think she's always with a brother who is just being weird. Or it's that kid, doesn't really care if he's not playing with anyone and he's doing his own thing for a while. And people are like, what's he up to? And she knows how to defend that. I don't want to ever put that on her. She shouldn't carry any responsibility for being a therapist to him, but it does really help. And then his youngest sister just adores him and follows him around everywhere. And she is my child who I think early on we were like, oh, there's definitely no diagnosis here. And it was startling how at 6 weeks I was like, she's fine. Like, she's not autistic. I could tell. And I don't think that I don't want to make it seem as though that's easy with every kid, but no, the amount of interaction and eye contact in those first 6 months was just so different. I, of course, didn't know with my first, but by the time that third one, I was like, oh, and there probably will be challenges to having a kid who's just like me. This youngest one and I are just the same mind. We know what we're thinking all the time. She's a great buddy, but boy, those teenage years, I'm really terrified. But they gain so much from having a brother who has to work really hard at certain things and who is a little different all the time. I think that cannot be underestimated, sort of one of those privileges of having a sibling with a different way of thinking.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask a funny question, just out of curiosity. What kind of music does he like?
Oh, he's so into yacht rock. It's embarrassing. And 70s. He actually is a guitarist, and music is another one of those weird gifts. We're a family of musicians, and I play violin and my husband plays piano, and so I was that Suzuki parent. So my oldest, he could not handle an instrument being close to his face, that too much, but guitar. So he plays classical guitar. He's going to Suzuki camp next week to work on his classical guitar. But when he's not playing classical guitar and creating songs, he's composing an album which is titled Analog Toilet. I'm not kidding. And he calls his band the Restroom Orchestra. It's bad. But he, when he's not doing that kind of goofy thing, he listens to a lot of 70s, a lot of what they call yacht rock. I don't know, the Doobie Brothers. I don't even know these songs, but my husband's like, hey,
sailing. Oh, I grew up then. I know that. I mean, I tried to avoid that. I know.
He loves it. It's so strange.
I know. But I was really curious about that because my experience with kids on that neurodiversity scale was music. That was one of the uniting things that I could see kids from all different types of typicality.
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing that I've talked with other parents, especially who did therapies with him growing up, we found that a lot of these kids who were forced into doing a lot of hard work at a pretty young age, they leave the ego behind. They're kind of like, oh, well, if they get to a difficult math equation, they're like, how do I solve this? They're not, I'm bad at math, because they've just been used to applying themselves in a way to get a result. They wanted to communicate and they learned how, but it took time. And maybe some of them still use a lot of visuals, but they find tools and they're creative about it. And with music, he practices and he gets things wrong and he just goes back and does it and drills it. He just drills things over and over. He doesn't go, oh, I can't do it. And versus his sisters, who are just like, all sorts of groaning and difficulty with, as soon as they can't do something, they're terrible at it and it's not even worth doing. And not necessarily. Everybody's that way to a certain extent. But one thing I found talking to a lot of parents is that these kids, as parents, you put them in therapies at 2 and it just kills you because you want them to be able to play. And those therapies should be fun. They should not be difficult. I mean, in that your child should want to go, but it is work. And I think having that background of having to work hard and pull in a lot of tools to communicate actually helps them in a lot of real world application. And learning an instrument and music is definitely one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds to me like he understands perseverance and grit in a way that people who didn't have to do that work early.
I
Yeah.
think so. And a lot of his peers, I think too, parents, we just all talk about how strange it is that they can just apply themselves and not worry about it. But it is true. He also has perfect pitch and sing on key, everything. We noticed when we were singing Happy Birthday that he got very angry at one point and we were like, what's wrong? And he's like, it's not how you're supposed to sing it. And he sang it. We're like, oh, he's singing in the key of D, which would be more typical. And we're singing at some, I don't remember, but we were not singing in the correct key. He did not like it. It was bad.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean,
Yeah.
I have no idea whether long term, I do think people try to look for kind of a genius thing in a lot of kids who are on the spectrum, and there isn't for everyone. There's not,
It's
and
a
who
range,
knows?
right, of IQ, just in the same way with the rest of us.
It's a range, and it just takes longer. You can't assess that at an early age. They really need till between 3rd and 6th grade to do any real IQ testing that's going to be accurate. And also that they will still, even if they have a predilection towards something, they still have to work at it. It's not like they're just going to do math figures off the top of their head without even thinking. Like they're going to study it. It's going to be an obsession of types, but
Right.
it might pan out well, but it also might be a useless skill. So
Right. Right.
and looking for that does not take away the difficulties that they have in communicating or in socializing or so a little bit of a red herring that I wish it gives people hope at times, but I do wish the lay public wouldn't always look for it just to sort of make things okay. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Agreed.
mhm.
Agreed. Yeah.
It's so
Brandy,
tricky.
do we have any questions? Hi, Brandy.
Don't have any questions from the audience just yet, but we do have one attendee. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function. I can go ahead and kick off the
Please.
Q&A portion, Chafen. And this is sort of a brighter note question. What is your biggest hope for your son's future? And as a parent who has to sort of help guide him through that, how do you see your role in helping him achieve that?
I don't know. I do hope he's so focused and he's like, I am going to write books and I am going to illustrate them and that's what I'm going to do. And he does spend hours and hours. Like I'm kind of like, well, if any kid could do this, but the practical side of me is like, you're going to have to get a degree in economics or engineering. Like, it's like part of me is like, no, we have to get a real job. But I think my hope is that he's able to follow some of his passions and that I can, make myself encourage him and not try to hold him back from some of these just more artistic things that he loves, because there are enough cartoonists in the world, but it could
Not
still be
him,
something.
not
It
him,
could still be something for him. That's right. It's not him.
not him.
But
Yeah.
and the other funny thing is, because he has very little filter and he talks out loud about a lot of things that I don't think most boys do, he really, really wants. He's been very obsessed lately about when will he get married and how many kids will he have and all of this. And it's sometimes I'm like, dude, you're gonna have to have a special lady. but
Right,
but I
right.
and I mean, this is assuming that that's his predilection, but I mean, so far because he's very open about things, he'll tell us what girls he likes in his class. We sort of know a lot more than we want to, but he just tells us things. But I do wish for him that he will be able to make relationships, and part of me doesn't doubt that he will find a way. If he really wants something, he can make things happen and works hard to get it. And he has made friendships. They're just more difficult. And he finds it easier to make friendships with girls, and boys are tougher.
Yeah.
So of course that is the dream. And if nothing else, he can live with his sisters. So.
That's not your hope. That's your
No,
the hope is that he gets
they have a great time.
yeah. It might happen, but it's not the
Yeah.
hope. Right.
It is just an interesting thing, because years ago we didn't know. I mean, he really didn't speak meaningfully until after 4, and so wouldn't have assumed that we'd even think about these things in the future. We were hoping that he wouldn't be fully dependent on us, that he'd be able to hold a job, and then he has made so much progress. But it's difficult to predict it, and a lot of kids who were with him at the early stages haven't made nearly as much. So
Yeah.
We do have one more question from the audience, which is, how do you talk about your son's autism with him?
Oh, yeah, this is a great question. And I have wondered how other people are doing this myself a lot. I tend to talk very openly. So we have, when we applied to schools, and every time we've done that, and he's been in very small, controlled environment schools. And we've been lucky because we could afford to do some private schooling for him and some Catholic school, which were very ordered. And we were always open. And we met with the teacher and we said, this is his diagnosis. This is what we're hoping to get out of this. Here's where we're going to need help. And the teacher would call us, especially in the early years of preschool and kindergarten. He's having issues with this. We'd have the therapist go to school all day. So we've always talked openly about it. And his sisters are far more aware in some ways than he is. And I sat down with him and I discussed what autism was, maybe a couple times in the last 2 years. And yet I swear 3 weeks ago, he's like, what is it that I have again? We're like,
Yeah.
But you don't want a child to use it as an excuse or a crutch. And you don't want them to necessarily perceive, of course, themselves as being different. But he's not dumb. He knows he has to go to speech therapy every week. He knows he's in social therapy. He knows he has a harder time connecting with other boys. So to me, the easiest thing is maybe similar to how some parents approach adoption, is that it's kind of always an open topic of discussion. And it is not meant to be something special or really difficult to talk about. It's very matter of fact. Oh yeah, this is what your current diagnosis is, and it's a struggle. It means you are going to work on these things. And your sister, she, may have trouble focusing, and she may need to do work on these things. And your youngest sister is a hot mess, and we got to just get her clothes in the morning.
I love that. Oh, I thank you very much. Do we have other questions, Brandy? That was a great ending.
No, we don't have any more questions. So I will leave it to you to close it out.
All right. Chafen Hart, I really appreciate this conversation. Not only was it fun and pleasurable because you are a wonderful speaker, but it was really healthy for me to hear, it isn't just that they're neuroatypical. They come with a unique set of gifts, challenges, and that if we're parenting well, we're looking at the whole thing.
Yes, yes. I hope so. I hope people can see it not as just a scary thing and can learn to live with the insecurity of it in order to get to the great fruits it could provide. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.